Welcome to Youth in Action, the Cheer podcast episode that explores the impact of COVID-19 on social justice and activism. I'm your host Anton, and today we'll be discussing how the pandemic has affected social justice and activism, as well as the role of young people in shaping the future. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought to light the many inequalities in our society, from the disproportionate impact of the virus on marginalized communities to the long-standing systemic issues that have made these communities more vulnerable. But it has also inspired many young people to take action, to stand up for what is right, and to fight for social justice. In this podcast, we'll be exploring the impact of the pandemic on social justice and activism, as well as discussing specific examples of young people's involvement in these movements. We'll also be interviewing a young activist to gain insights into their experiences and thoughts on the role of young people in shaping the future. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into the world of social justice and activism during the pandemic. Let's start. As we know, the pandemic has highlighted the existing inequalities in our society, and has motivated young people to get involved in social justice and activism. Many people have been directly impacted by the pandemic, from losing their jobs to struggling to pay their bills, while others have been affected by the systemic issues that have made certain communities more vulnerable. And in the face of these challenges, young people have been taking action. We've seen countless examples of young people's involvement in social justice and activism during the pandemic, from organizing protests for racial justice to advocating for equitable vaccine distribution. These actions have brought attention to the issues that have been overlooked for far too long, and have been instrumental in driving social change. But the pandemic has also presented new challenges for social justice and activism. With social distancing and lockdowns in place, it has become more difficult to organize and gather in person. And with so much of our lives taking place online, it has become increasingly challenging to separate fact from fiction and to find credible sources of information. So, while the pandemic has certainly highlighted the need for social justice and activism, it has also presented new challenges and forced us to adapt to a new way of organizing and advocating. In the following minutes, we'll be interviewing a young activist to gain insights into their experiences and thoughts on the role of young people in shaping the future. Now it's time to welcome our guest, Valentina, a young activist who has been involved in social justice movements during the pandemic. Valentina, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us a bit about your involvement in social justice and activism during the pandemic?
Sure. I've been involved in a number of different movements, including Black Lives Matter and climate justice. During the pandemic, I've been participating in online protests, signing petitions, and attending virtual rallies. It's been a challenging time to organize, but I think it's more important now than ever to keep pushing for change.
That's great to hear. How has the pandemic affected your activism and the challenges you've faced?
Well, as I mentioned, it's been more difficult to organize and gather in person. It's also been challenging to keep up with the news and stay informed, especially with all the misinformation that's out there. But I think the pandemic has also given us an opportunity to think creatively, and find new ways to make our voices heard.
That's a great point. What are your thoughts on the role of young people in shaping the future?
I think young people have a huge role to play in shaping the future. We're the ones who are going to inherit the world that we're living in right now, and we have a responsibility to make it a better place. I also think that young people bring a lot of energy and new perspectives to the table, and that's really important for driving change.
Absolutely. And what advice would you give to other young people who are interested in getting involved in social justice and activism?
I would say, start small and find something that you're passionate about. There are so many different issues to get involved in, and it can be overwhelming at first. But if you start with something that you care about, you'll be more motivated to keep going. And don't be afraid to make mistakes or ask for help. We're all learning together.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights and experiences with us, Valentina. It's been great having you on the show.
Thank you.
In the next part of our podcast, we'll be discussing the impact of COVID-19 on politics and social change. The pandemic has highlighted existing political and social issues, as well as creating new challenges. Let's dive into it. One of the most significant impacts of the pandemic has been on politics. Governments around the world have had to make difficult decisions in response to the crisis, from implementing lockdowns to allocating resources for vaccine distribution. These decisions have often been contentious, and there has been a lot of debate about the role of government in protecting public health. At the same time, the pandemic has also highlighted the need for systemic change. As we've seen, the communities that have been hit the hardest by the pandemic are often the same ones that are disproportionately affected by poverty, racism, and other forms of inequality. The pandemic has brought these issues to the forefront, and there's a growing movement for social change. But there are also new challenges that come with advocating for change during a pandemic. As we discussed earlier, it's more difficult to organize and gather in person, and there's a lot of misinformation and fake news out there. So, how do we navigate these challenges and continue to drive social change? Well, one thing that's become clear is that we need to be creative and adapt to the new circumstances. Virtual organizing has become increasingly popular, and there have been some innovative online campaigns that have been very successful. We also need to be vigilant about misinformation and work to promote credible sources of information. Ultimately, the pandemic has shown us that the issues we face are interconnected, and that we need to work together to address them. Whether it's politics or social change, we need to stay informed, stay engaged, and keep pushing for a better world. We'll be discussing some of the positive changes that have emerged during the pandemic and what we can learn from them. So, let's share some tips and tricks for how young people can be active in their environment. First and foremost, find a cause that you're passionate about. Whether it's climate change, racial justice, or gender equality, there are so many important issues to get involved in. Once you've identified a cause, do some research to find out how you can make a difference. One way to get involved is to join a local organization or group that's working on the issue. You can also attend protests or rallies, sign petitions, and write letters to your elected officials. Social media can also be a powerful tool for raising awareness and mobilizing others. Another important tip is to be persistent and patient. Social change doesn't happen overnight, and it often takes a long time to see results. But if you stay committed and keep pushing for change, you can make a difference. It's also important to listen and learn from others. Engage with people from different backgrounds and perspectives, and try to understand their experiences and viewpoints. This will not only help you become a better advocate, but it will also help build bridges and bring people together. And finally, don't be afraid to take care of yourself. Activism can be emotionally and mentally taxing, and it's important to prioritize your own well-being. Take breaks when you need them, and seek out support from friends, family, or mental health professionals if necessary. So, there you have it. Some tips and tricks for how young people can be active in their environment. Remember, even small actions can make a big difference. Thanks for tuning in to our show today. We hope you found it informative and inspiring. That brings us to the end of our podcast. We hope you found it informative and inspiring. Today, we discussed the impact of COVID-19 on social justice and activism, as well as politics and social change. We heard from a young activist about the importance of youth engagement and the power of collective action. We also explored some of the challenges and opportunities presented by the pandemic, from the need for virtual organizing to the importance of credible sources of information. But despite these challenges, we also highlighted the positive changes that have emerged during the pandemic, from increased awareness of social issues to the power of community solidarity. And that's a wrap for our podcast today. We hope you found our discussion on the Cheer initiative informative and inspiring. Remember, CHEER's main goal is to provide equal opportunities for young people who are weakened by mental health problems. With the recent civilization changes and the COVID-19 crisis, mental health issues have become more prevalent than ever before. Cheer aims to improve the well-being of young people, both mentally and physically. We'd also like to remind our listeners that the European Commission's support for the production of this podcast does not constitute endorsement of the contents, which reflects the views only of the authors, and the Commission cannot be held responsible for any use which may be made of the information contained therein. Thank you for tuning into our podcast, and we look forward to bringing you more informative and inspiring content in the future. We want to leave you with a reminder that every person has the power to make a difference. Whether it's through activism, volunteer work, or simply having conversations with friends and family, you have the ability to create positive change in your community and beyond. So, let's continue to stay informed, stay engaged, and keep pushing for a better world. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on our podcast.